I mean, literally, 2 Corinthians 10:4 and 5.
Mhm,
Paul tells us that within spiritual warfare, our aim is to destroy strongholds.
right.
And what is a stronghold? Well, he defines it in the next verse, and he says any basically any false belief or set of beliefs that will hinder someone from coming to the knowledge of God.
Mhm.
And so, our job as believers, not just apologists, believers in the church, our job is to, he uses harsh words here, to destroy, demolish, tear down the strongholds within our culture.
Right.
And so that is part of our task as believers.
Hey, welcome back to Campfire Apologetics. I'm Mark Hudson, and I am also on the Truth and Love Network, Truth in Love. And so check that out. Be sure to go to truthinlovenetwork.com. Check out all the things they have coming up, different conferences. There's one in Kentucky in October. Be sure to check that out, called the Laborers Conference. And all kinds of really awesome guys in that network doing really awesome things. So, check it out. But today I want to introduce Eric Hernandez. We're doing an episode about the brain and the mind and the kind of material and immaterial aspects of that, how that points to the Christian worldview, how it points away from naturalism. And I've done an episode in the past about this, but I actually heavily pulled from Eric's material for that episode. So I figured he would probably be a really great person to have on the show to talk about this and maybe go further in depth because he's probably done more research and study in this area than I have. And I find it to be super interesting. And so I just want to introduce Eric Hernandez to you of EHM Apologetics. Eric, you can maybe give us a rundown of who you are and what it is that you do, and whatever you want us to know about you. If you're married, you have kids, where you live, whatever, if you like long walks on the beach and those types of things. So, but welcome and thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a blessing to be here. Yeah, so as you said, my name's Eric Hernandez. Married 11 years, wife, 2 kids, a son and daughter. My daughter's 17, just turned 17 last month. My son is 8. I run a ministry called EHM Apologetics. And essentially, it exists in order to equip believers and reach skeptics. The slogan for the ministry is plant seeds and pull weeds. I My heart is in apologetics and evangelism. In fact, I often say that I am an apologist because I'm an evangelist. So
Mhm.
the planting seeds aspect refers to evangelism. The pulling weeds refers to removing obstacles that the non-believer may have toward the gospel. And because I think a lot of times we either try to reap from places where we have not yet even sown, or sometimes Scripture refers to the different type of soil, soil with rocky soil and whatnot, and sometimes we have to till the ground. We have to do some gardening work, as Greg Coco would say, before we can bring in a
Mhm.
harvest.
Yeah, yeah, amen. I love Greg. He's got all kinds of awesome stuff. I've had him on as well, and
Very
he's
nice.
just a wealth of information, and that man is just like a walking, apologetic encyclopedia. So it's it's awesome to talk to him, and it's awesome to have you on. And I think you touched on an important point when it comes to apologetics is that you can't really separate it from evangelism. You're an apologist because you're an evangelist, and those two things go pretty much hand in hand because when you're doing evangelism, a lot of the time you're going to get pushback or questions. And once you start responding to the pushback or answering questions, well, you've entered into apologetic mode and now you're doing apologetics. So they are very closely linked together. So I agree, and I think that's awesome that you pointed that out. Um, yeah, today I definitely, like I said, I pulled a bit from I think some articles I found online that you had written on the issue of the brain and the mind, how they're two separate things. There's a material aspect, there's an immaterial aspect. And I really appreciated a lot of what you said in that article. A lot of it was actually very helpful, because when it comes to this topic, I think it can get kind of confusing, kind of differentiate those things. So maybe you can kind of break down the difference between the mind and the brain. And so, like, what are we talking about? I guess if we were to define terms here, I think that's probably a good place to start, would be to start there so that we can make sense of that and then move on from there.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would just clarify. I would say that the mind and brain are distinct, while embodied. I wouldn't say they're necessarily separated. There's definitely a deep integration there,
Hmm.
but they're definitely distinct entities.
Hmm.
And essentially, so the brain and central nervous system, I'm sure we'd all agree, is something physical. It's something that has spatial extension. It's something that has weight, size, shape, and whatnot. By contrast, the mind is something that we would define ostensively. Now, what that means is you would point to an instance or give an example of it to quote unquote define it. Um, to illustrate, if I were to ask you, how do you describe the color purple to someone who's born blind? Well, you couldn't, right? Because they have no experiential knowledge of what the color purple is. So the only way you can define purple is by pointing to an instance or example of it. Now, I've had people push back and say, well, you can define it in terms of wavelength. We can touch more on that later, but no, describing wavelength to someone who's blind isn't going to do anything. This is going to tell them what purple is. On top of that, some people would assume you need light to see color. Well, I could close my eyes right now, and in my mind, picture a pink elephant, and I can have a sensation of pinkness. Yet there's no color in my. I mean, there's no light rather in my brain. So, what is the mind? Let's start with that, or consciousness. Well, there are 5 states of consciousness, and here's a way to think about it. So we're going to be talking about substances, states, and properties. Now, I'm what you call a substance dualist. Essentially, that means there are two aspects to me. There is something physical, and then there's an immaterial substance, namely the soul. So I am a soul. I don't, quote, have a soul, but rather I am a soul. And a soul without a body without a soul is nothing more than a corpse. And here's where I typically say that I've actually changed my mind on this, because I do think we have souls. Because mine's parked in my garage. It's a Kia Soul. It's orange. Bought it a few years ago. And I bought that car just to make that joke.
Yeah.
It's a very rich punchline, if you
Yeah.
will. I was soul searching when I was looking for it. I have to milk it for every penny, because I'm not joking when I say I bought that car just to make this joke.
You're a dad, so you have to
That's right.
pay. Yeah, you have to pay the bills on
That's
the
right.
dad jokes.
That's right. Yeah. So you think of water. So water is a physical substance, and if you know the property that water has at any given moment, it will indicate what state it's in. So if I tell you that there's some water in my room and it's in a liquid or fluidity state of fluidity, then you know that it's going to be a fluid. If I say that I've got water in my room right now and it has the property of being hard, then you know it's in a solid state, and so on and so forth. Now, substance dualism again. I am a immaterial substance, a soul, and I have a physical aspect to me. Now, again, I can't help but pause, because I know some people, let's just say non-believers or atheists, when I have discussions or debates on this topic, they'll immediately jump in and say, well, that's a contradiction in terms. How can there be an immaterial substance? And that's just because they're ignorant of the history of philosophy and the word. In fact, a lot of the terms that we use in science come from philosophy. So Aristotle was
Right.
the one to coin the word substance, and that simply means to stand under. So just like a submarine is something that goes under, and a subway is something that is underneath a train under, if you will. A substance is a thing that stands under its properties. So what are properties? Properties are things that you can typically identify them with words that end in ity or ness, like redness or triangularity. So there is something that possesses or grounds these properties, because when properties show up in the world, they don't just float around by themselves. For example, when I get on the freeway, I don't avoid hitting the property redness with my car. Rather, I avoid objects that possess the property of redness. So, properties are going to be grounded in something. Now, water being a substance can come in three different states: solid, liquid, and gas. And then each of these have their distinct properties. And when you understand the property of a thing or what properties a thing possesses, it will indicate or allude to the kind of thing that it is, its very nature. So, with that in mind, consciousness or the mind comes in five states. So, I am a substance, my soul, and I have a mind that comes in five different states. The five states of consciousness would be thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and volition, or we can say acts of will. Now, why those five? Well, because any given state that you're in mentally is going to fall into one of those five. And we could say five because each of them are distinct enough to be separate from the other, or rather distinct from the other. So, for example, take thoughts and beliefs. Sure, the difference being is that I can have thoughts that I don't believe, and I can believe things that I'm not currently thinking, right? So there's five of these distinct states. Now, when it comes to the question of the nature or existence of the soul, and included under that umbrella would be the nature and existence of the mind. Um, some people think, well, how can we solve this issue, or how can we answer these questions? Now, some will erroneously I'd say punt to science, or they think science is, the end all be all, and that's a whole other separate issue. It's an epistemology known as scientism, when someone believes that science is the only or best way to gain knowledge about reality. Shameless plug. I have a few chapters of that in my book when it comes to worldview and strongholds. But the reason that that's the wrong place to go is because the soul, if it exists, is going to be a non-physical entity by definition, whereas science is a tool, a wonderful tool, that is limited to studying the physical world. So I can't use something that is limited to studying only the physical to try and investigate something non-physical. That's what we would call in philosophy a category fallacy. To illustrate, suppose why this assumption fails. Suppose your neighbor is arguing with your other neighbor, and you're trying to figure out what the problem is. And you'd approach them, being the good peacemaking Christian you are, and you say, "Hey, I heard you guys arguing. Is there any way I can help, or maybe moderate and try to come to some kind of a peaceful agreement?" And neighbor number one says, "Well, yeah, I told this guy that there's an invisible man in my house, and he didn't believe me, so I invited him over to come investigate for himself." And then neighbor number two says, "Yep, and I went to go investigate, and I asked, the neighbor to step out of his house, and for 2 hours I investigated, and I never saw the invisible man anywhere. I looked under the bed, I looked in the closet, I looked in the bathroom, looked in the attic, and never once did I ever see this invisible man." Now, of course, the neighbor number two, the other neighbor, he like pulls at his hair and in frustration says, "Of course you can't see him; he's invisible." Now, what this neighbor said in response doesn't prove that there is an invisible man at his house, but at the very least, it tells us that if you're going to object to the existence of this invisible man, you cannot appeal to your sense of sight, because that is something that is both consistent with and predicted by the very thing he's claiming exists. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, what got me into this field, I'll share briefly, is freshman year of college. I took my first philosophy class. Really enjoyed it, even though I later found out my professor was an atheist. And I really wasn't necessarily interested in philosophy. I just figured I needed to fill up an elective, freshman year of college, and I needed an easy A, a class that, one of those classes you could probably skip in the morning. You didn't have to necessarily pay attention. And I thought philosophy was just making stuff up and sharing your opinion. And so I figured, well, I can do this in my sleep. This should be a pretty easy A. But I really enjoyed it. I fell in love with it. I was allowed to ask questions. I liked how I was challenged. Now, second semester, I want to take another class in philosophy, but everyone warns me not to take Professor Pena's class in particular, because he's antagonistic and condescending, and his goal is going to be to make you lose your faith. And my thought was, well, where can I sign up? Now, mind you, though, at the time, I had no idea what apologetics was, probably hadn't even heard the word. All I knew was that I wanted to learn, wanted to grow. And I also knew that if Christianity is true, then I should know why. But I also understood that if Christianity were false, I'd still like to know why, and maybe this is a guy for the job. And while there are lots of moments in his class that I can touch on, there was one class in particular that was pivotal to my life and ministry that, in a real sense, set me to where I am now. And in this class, he walks in and as before he begins his lecture, he reaches into his coat pocket and he pulls out this antidepressant pill and he stares at it in the light kind of dramatically. And then he starts his lecture and he says, "Religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And because of the soul, we can have hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have gone before us. But the problem is that, according to Christianity, your thoughts and sensations and desires are also supposed to be contained within this alleged immaterial soul. But if I took this antidepressant pill," he said, "it has a power to change and affect the alleged immaterial states of my soul. But how could that be? Because why should something tiny and physical have the power to affect or change the immaterial?" And then he said, because every time a scientist looks at your brain or scans your brain, all they find are neurons firing. And every time a scientist looks at the body under a microscope, all they find are the base elements of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. But no scientist has found anything even remotely close to something like a soul. And how do we explain this? And he said, well, I'll tell you how. The answer is that there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. You are just a physical brain and body, a meat machine, and we need to learn to live with this fact, get on with our lives, and stop believing in these fanciful, foolish fairy tales. And essentially, class dismissed. Now, what troubled me was that, I'll give you the short version. 1 Corinthians 15 says, if there is no resurrection of the dead, Paul says, essentially Christianity is false. Well, I submit to you that if there is no soul, then there can be no resurrection, and thus, by the same line of logic, Christianity would be false. Now, at the time, I didn't know what to do with that. Again, had no idea what apologetics was, hadn't even touched it, looked into it, or anything of that nature. But I bring that up because, aside from the fact that this is what got me into this field, this area of study, note how what he's doing is very similar to the analogy I just gave about looking for the invisible man. It's the wrong tool for the assessment.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be like, to give one more example, it'd be like if you asked me how much do I weigh, I said, I don't know, hand me that ruler, let's find out. Again,
Right.
it's simply the wrong tool for the assessment. And unfortunately, this idea is prevalent. And I think it's because our culture is saturated with the view of naturalism, which would essentially state that everything is identical or reducible to something physical. And well, clearly, if that's the case, then the only way to investigate quote unquote reality and all that there is by using science and investigating the physical. But note, it begs the question that everything is identical and reducible to the physical. So, going back to mind and brain, if what my professor said was true, then that would mean that my mind and brain are the same thing. Because again, if everything that exists is physical, then my mind, if it exists, and I say if because there are some philosophers that have come to deny that consciousness exists, and we can touch on that later, then it must be, again, identical or reducible to something physical. Now, in philosophy, when we say that two things are identical, we mean it's literally the same thing as. So, for example, if I said Eric Hernandez and the guest currently on your show, note how I'm using two different titles, but I'm talking about one singular person. Why? Because Eric Hernandez and the guest on your show are identical. They're the same person. Now, this gives us what we call Leibniz's law of identity, and it's a test for identity. And if you want the bigger word, if your listeners want to know the really big fancy word for that, it's Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. So they can impress their friends with that later on. And if any single guys are listening, Christian ladies go crazy over this stuff.
Yeah. Say that 5 times fast.
That's right. Yeah. So this Leibniz's law gives us a test for identity, and it essentially states this: if there are two things in question that we may perhaps assume are identical, if we can look at the properties, and even in principle, if we can find something that is true of one that is not true of the other, or vice versa, then we know that therefore they cannot be the same thing. So, to give an illustration here for that, suppose you walk into a lab and you see two bottles of clear fluid, and you want to know whether or not these two substances are identical. But let's suppose we don't want to use any lab equipment, right? We don't want to use any empirical testing for this. Well, what we can do is we can look at the properties. Now, you pick both of them up and you see that, well, they're both fluid, they're both clear. And based on this, you assume that, well, they're likely identical substances. Now, suppose there was labels on the front and one of them said water, but the other one had a label that was ripped off. And let's call this one chemical X. Well, so far you think that they're both the same substance until you turn them over. And on the back of the bottle that has a label ripped off, you see another label that says caution flammable. Immediately you have this epiphany and you think, well, I know that water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what this chemical X is, at the very least, I can already conclude that they're not the same substance. They're not identical. Why? Because there is something true of one that is not true of the other, and vice versa. So, with this in mind, if what my professor said was true, like I said, then that would mean that the mind and brain are the same thing. But if we can find in principle something true of one that's not true of the other, and vice versa, then we know that they cannot be the same thing. And this is trivially easy to do. And all we need is one example. So, and before I go further there, I want to stop because I went on for a while. Any questions or comments on that so far?
No, just well, yeah. I mean, I appreciate the correction you made there that the mind and brain are not separate; they're distinct. You know, that was probably my my mistake there. But yeah,
No, it's okay.
that is a good point to make. You know, because they're not separate because they do work together. They're just distinct, being that they are different. And you're like you were literally the kid in the God's Not Dead movie.
Oh gosh, yeah.
in the philosophy class with his teacher berating him and you know
What's funny
using,
is, so I would, because you don't know me, I'll let it slide. I say that jokingly. 'Cause I was gonna say that's like one of the biggest insults you can give me,
oh
only
no,
because people who know me personally know I hate that movie.
I'm not
Gosh,
a
I
fan
can't
of it
stand
either,
it.
but
Yeah, I know.
just remember that scene, you know, watching it like it's like I mean it's not even just that movie. I guess you've seen it in a bunch of different areas where it's like you have this atheist professor who's you
Yeah.
know just coming at the Christian. It's funny that the philosophy professor always seems to be an atheist for some reason. Um,
Yeah. Well, here's what was funny you say that because I compare myself to that all the time, and then I just follow it with, and by the way, I hate that movie.
yeah.
Because even adding to the story, so my very first one-on-one public debate was actually with that professor that I just talked about.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so it was very similar in that aspect to the movie. I just can't stand that movie with my goodness, it is an abomination. So anyways, going back to yeah, so now to even clarify what you were saying, I mean, sure, you and I would both grant that the mind and brain can be separated. Um, but that's, of course, a different issue because some people, when we talk about this, they'll say, well, show me how, show me how the mind can be separated from the brain. How can a mind exist without a brain? And the assumption there is that I'm trying to argue that they are necessarily separated or something to that extent, right? But note, I don't have to argue for disembodiment or separation. All I have to show is that they're not identical. That the mind is not identical to the brain. So going back to that, we've already, to recap, we've established that um, if physicalism is true, and that would be the philosophical term for the idea that there is no soul, human beings are just purely physical properties and parts. Um, so if physicalism is true, then the mind or consciousness, if it exists, is going to be identical or reducible to something physical. And again, to show that they're not, you simply have to show that they don't share the same properties. So I'll give you three quick examples. My Take a state of my mind. So take a thought or a belief. My thoughts and beliefs can be true or false. All right, I can have a thought or belief, and that belief can be true or false. So my thoughts and beliefs can have the properties of being true or false. Now, we know that whenever you have a thought, there's going to be a correlated brain state with that, right? So if I'm thinking grass is green, there's going to be neurons firing in my brain that are going to correlate with that thought. Now, note though that my thought can be true or false, but that correlated group of neurons firing isn't true or false. Right? It wouldn't even make sense to say that the neurons firing in my left hemisphere of my brain are firing false, but the ones in the right hemisphere are firing true. Right? They just fire. There's no true or false to their firing, and so immediately we can see that while states of my mind, like my thoughts or beliefs, can be true or false, the correlated group of neurons firing aren't true or false. So right away, we see that they're not the same thing. Second, we can say that my brain can be in a state that weighs, let's say, 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. And while your
The more
listeners
thoughts
may
you have,
be,
the heavier your brain is.
what's that?
It's like the more thoughts you have, the heavier your brain is.
Right, yeah, yeah. So that I was going to say, it's like, so for your listeners, even though we may be having heavy thoughts right now, right, we're not going to go buy a neck brace when we're done with this
Right.
podcast. And so that right there is another way to show that they're not identical. Now, third, so my brain can be in a state that measures, say, 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is a sensation in my mind, is not 7 inches long. Like if you've been into a banana, it wouldn't make sense for me to ask you how many inches long was that taste of banana, right? It's a category fallacy.
Yeah, yeah.
And while there's many more examples we can get into, and feel free to go wherever you want from here, the point is simply this: if all the properties of my brain are physical and all the properties of my mind are not physical, well, then it would follow that consciousness, if it exists, it can't be identical or reducible to the physical, and thus physicalism or naturalism can't be true.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was all really good and deeply philosophical in it. And I think that that's maybe why I'm interested in this subject is that it gets so deep but at the beginning it was also something that was very hard to wrap my mind around and my or wrap my brain around. I don't know, maybe they're the same thing. No, I'm just kidding.
Mind, yeah.
But
I mean, I'm
but
glad you said mind.
yeah. um but yeah, it's I think one of my kind of go-to points or arguments when it comes to the distinction between the mind and the brain is that if there is no distinction between those things, if everything is reduced to physical states or matter or um, chemicals just firing, really you have no basis at all for being able to trust your reasoning or your thoughts or any of your knowledge or anything that you say. And I think an important question to ask somebody who holds to this kind of physicalist or materialist idea is that how would non rational processes such as chemicals kind of fizzing in your brain, um, how would those processes create rationality? And I don't think that there's really an answer for that. You know, it's like, in other words, if our thoughts are purely the result of non-rational physical activities just happening in our brain, then how can we trust our thoughts or truly know really anything at all with any level of certainty? And I think that their position kind of crumbles at that point because like you brought up, there's just chemicals firing here and chemicals firing here, but which one is right or wrong? It's kind of I heard it likened to if you were to shake up two cans of soda, a Coke and a Pepsi, and you open each can and they're both fizzing, which one is right or wrong? That's basically what it comes down to is if it's just chemical fizz, it's just chemicals happening in your brain, then there's really no way to know right or wrong or to know anything. So I think that that's like one of the bigger points that I like to go to, and I think it's what C.S. Lewis called the argument from reason. I believe if I'm remembering correctly, essentially if your thoughts are caused by chemistry instead of guided by truth, then you have no basis for trusting your reasoning at all. And yeah, so what are your thoughts on all of that? I think that those are good places to go. I think those are some good questions to ask. A non-rational process creating rationality. I don't think that the logic follows in that. I guess in that worldview.
Yeah, so that's definitely an area I go to. In fact, when I often do debates, I like to do like a combination of C.S. Lewis's argument from reason and Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Mm,
But and we can definitely go there. So that would be like an epistemic argument against
mhm,
like naturalism.
mhm,
So far, what I've talked about has been a type of ontological argument of
mhm.
the ontology that deals with the existence itself.
Yeah, yeah.
That the existence of the mind, it can't be identical or reducible to something physical like the brain. And so, what we have here is that. So let's touch on the free will aspect. The way I would argue the free will aspect, which definitely does lean into and overlaps with the argument from reason, um, but let's looking just at the free will aspect itself. If physicalism is true and we're just purely physical properties and parts, well, the problem then becomes is that everything becomes subject to the laws of nature, the laws of chemistry and physics. Now, if there is no God, no soul, then what's something called the law of causal closure would be true. And causal closure is the idea that every physical event must have a prior physical cause. So if there's a physical event, then you need a prior physical cause in order to explain it. Nothing from the outside can come in. So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that physicalism is true. Now, let's look at some simple action, something as simple as moving a. Here's the illustration Aristotle used. If I move, he said, if I move a rock with my staff, then I know that the staff moved the rock, my hand moved the staff, but then the question becomes what moved me. Now, I would say that to have free will, you would at the very least need to be the originator or source of your will or action. So if I lift my hand up and I cause my hand to move, and I was the first mover of this chain of events, then we can say, okay, then I had free will. But if you were to tase me and it made my arm shoot up, well, then now you are the cause of my hand going up. So I wasn't the first mover in that instance, and thus I didn't have free will. Now, going back to Aristotle's example of the rock being moved by the staff and the staff by the hand, and then the question, what moved me? Now, if physicalism is true and the law of causal closure is true, then you're going to have to point to some physical event prior to your hand moving. Now, if the physicalist or naturalist wants to maintain free will, well, then they would have to point to something within themselves. And what most might want to do here is say, well, there's a group of neurons that fired in my brain, and that caused my hand to move, that caused the staff to move, that caused the rock to move. And so, problem solved. Well, the issue here is that recall that if there is no God, no soul, then the law of causal closure is true, which means every physical event must have a prior physical cause. Well, neurons firing in your brain are a physical event and thus require a prior physical cause. So at this point is where you have a fork in the road for the physicalist. On the one hand, they can say, well, a prior group of neurons firing caused the first group of neurons to fire, and that made my hand move, that made the staff move, that made the rock move. But then once again, you have the same problem. That is a physical event that also requires a prior physical cause.
There's no termination point, essentially. It's just
Right. So on that option, it leads to what's called an infinite regress.
right.
You just have neurons firing all the way down without end. But then if that's the case, then the action never gets accomplished. So that option seems to have to go out the window. The second option now is at some point, the person can say, well, however many group of neurons you want to posit that are firing, at some point, something external and prior to myself caused those neurons to fire, which caused my hand to move, that caused the staff to move, that caused the rock to move. But in this instance, now you have something external and prior to yourself that is causing these events, which means you're no longer the first mover. You are now a secondary intermediate mover. And thus, you don't have free will in this instance. But a bigger problem is that this would apply to any and every event or action that you take. That includes your thoughts, your beliefs, your desires. If everything has a prior physical cause, including all those things, then all your thoughts, desires, sensations, everything I mentioned is already causally determined to be what it is, and it couldn't be otherwise. Which means, so I like to, I'll put it like, well, let me say one more thing, and then I'll wrap, I'll wrap it together to make the point. So going back to, so if we're just purely physical machines, then we don't have free will. We don't have the freedom to think, the freedom to believe, the freedom to change our minds. And anything that may look like it is really just are perceiving it that way. But in reality, all my beliefs would be causally determined. So I like to say that means that those who quote unquote claim to be atheists or free thinkers, right? There's a lot of atheists who call themselves free thinkers. And what they mean by that is that they are not brainwashed or shackled by the chains of religion. They are free to think for themselves. But the irony is that if atheism is true, there is no God, naturalism is true, then every belief that the person has is caused by external factors, and they cannot claim rational responsibility for these beliefs. And quite literally, the last thing they can call themselves is a free thinker. So that's the irony of this. Now, another problem this adds is that, well, now you get rid of moral responsibility. That goes out the window.
Mm-hmm.
To illustrate, remember, to have free will, you have to be the first mover in a chain of events. Now, suppose there was a murder committed with the gun, and we investigate the crime scene, and we see that it was actually the bullet that penetrated the heart that caused the death. But note that we're not going to blame the bullet, because we know that the bullet didn't act on its own, but it was caused by something prior to itself, namely the gun. So now let's look at the gun. Do we blame the gun? It depends who you vote for. No, I'm joking.
So I was just going to make a joke.
So no, we typically, we're not going to blame the gun, right? Because we know that the gun didn't fire on its own. It was caused by someone pulling the trigger. So now we get back to the person who's holding the gun, and what we would do in a sane world is we're going to blame the person for this chain of events that caused the murder, because we know that they were the first mover. However, again, if there is no God, no soul, physicalism is true, then the person, much like the gun and bullet, was actually caused by something external prior to himself. So he too, like the gun and bullet, was a secondary mover in this chain of events. In other words, if I don't blame the gun or bullet, I can't blame the person for these secondary causes that led to the murder. So to recap, there's no free will. You cannot claim rational responsibility for your beliefs, and then moral responsibility just goes out the window. Now, how does this relate into, let's even say the aspect of evangelism, right? Hence the book title, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism. I was at a friend's Christmas party years ago, their company Christmas party, and as I was, just talking with some of the other the employees, one guy, he asked me, what I did and stuff like that. And this was before I was in the position I am now, but I was still a minister, still doing apologetics here and there. And when I mentioned that, he said, "Oh, that's interesting. Well, I used to be a Christian, but as I began to study the evidence and follow the evidence where it leads, the most rational route for me to take was to become an atheist." I said, "That's interesting." I said, "Tell me about that. What was it that led to that?" And mind you, we're in a Christmas environment party. I want to keep it relatively cordial and whatnot. And this is where my lazy approach comes in. I want to gather information. And he said, well, he said, first, as I began to study the question of like morality, and what I notice is that it seems to be religion that suppresses a woman's right to choose what she wants to do with her body, and it suppresses people's rights to marry who they love, and you look at like these like 9/11 and other instances like this, and religion is a big cause of war and hate crimes, yada yada. And he said, and then I began to study the question of free will. And what I discovered was that, you really don't choose to believe in God. You're really just a byproduct of your environment, of where you grew up, of how you were raised. And I came to realize that, we don't even really choose to believe in God. And so as I kind of, put these pieces together, I figured, well, it would seem like there is no God. And the most logical conclusion for him, he said, was to become an atheist. Now, he pretty much set up the pieces for me.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
said, well,
A
I
lot
said,
there.
let me, yeah, I said, let me recap this just to make sure I understand you. It seems that there were two things that brought you to where you're at. One is that, evil is done in the name of religion, or religious people do bad things, immoral things. And two, that we don't have the freedom to even believe in God or not in the first place. He said, yep, pretty much. I said, okay. I said, well, I have a few questions, if you don't mind, concerning the things you said. He said, sure. I said, well, on the one hand, you seem to want to hold these religious people morally responsible for what they do. But then you also told me that there's no free will. So if there is no free will, how can you hold these people morally responsible to do what they did if they were just causally determined to do what they did and they could not have done otherwise? And then his eyebrows lifted up pretty high and he said, I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. I said, okay, yeah, no problem. I said, well, yeah, it's, something to chew on. I said, but can I ask you another question? He said, absolutely. I said, then you told me you talked about free will and you said how, we really don't have the freedom to believe in God or not believe in God. I said, but wouldn't that apply to your atheism as well? Because if all your beliefs are causally determined by things external and prior to yourself and you couldn't believe otherwise, I said, I suppose, and the question I want to know is, do you believe that you freely came to believe that there was no free will? Or were you determined to believe that and you couldn't believe otherwise? And if that's the case, then why should I believe what you were determined to believe when I was determined to believe something else? All that to say is I planted a seed and pulled a weed, so to speak.
Mhm.
I left him with something to chew on because most people won't even consider an alternative worldview unless they realize that there is cracks in their own foundation, if you will.
Mhm.
And part of the aspect of evangelism is showing people that no, your worldview cannot sustain the very fundamental things that we want to uphold, consciousness included. And then, if you want, we can even touch on next how some philosophers have wanted to deny the very existence of consciousness in order to avoid this problem.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things I think in apologetics is pointing out inconsistencies in worldviews. How your worldview actually can't sustain the actual claims that you're making. They kind of fall apart on themselves. Um, what were you saying there at the end that you might want to get into? Philosophers. What was that?
Well, yeah, and to even touch on what you just said, so this is, I mean, literally 2 Corinthians 10:4 and 5.
Mhm, mhm.
Paul tells us that within spiritual warfare, our aim is to destroy strongholds.
Right.
And what is a stronghold? Well, he defines it in the next verse, and he says any basically any false belief or set of beliefs that will hinder someone from coming to the knowledge of God.
Mhm.
And so our job as believers, not just apologists, believers in the church, our job is to, he uses harsh words here, to destroy, demolish, tear down the strongholds within our culture.
Right.
And so that is part of our task as believers.
Yeah.
And what I was saying was, so, and there's so many areas we can go to, but just
I did wanna
to
ask a question about
oh yeah,
something you were
please.
talking about earlier, but I was just, what you were saying we can get into this other, aspect or this other thing. I would like to get into that. Um, yeah, I was just asking what that however you put it, I can't remember how you put it, um, but yeah, I guess we'll get into what you're kinda leading into there, but what I wanted to ask is, um, you were mentioning your professor earlier, and he kind of made the argument that you could take a pill and that pill will alter your mind, and that kind of proves that your mind is this physical thing instead of this immaterial thing. And I kind of liken that to the same situation or maybe analogy that people might make is how are the mind and the brain distinct when you can get brain damage and it alters the mind. Like you'll get into a car wreck and you'll get a really bad head injury, and from that point on your mind is altered along with your brain. Now I've dealt with that very question in previous episodes, but I would like to get your thoughts on, how does that how would we answer that, or how would you answer that And is that an argument for the physical mind and brain?
Yeah, so this is essentially the same argument my professor was making.
Right, right.
Um, and I go deeper in the book, but essentially the short version is, uh, I mean, it's like I want to say, well, no, duh, right, to the person using that as an objection.
Yeah.
So you're telling me like, and by the way, this is not some new discovery in neuroscience. You know, cavemen would have understood that if
Right.
you hit me over the head with the club really hard, I'm going to get dizzy.
Yeah.
This is not some new epiphany that we've come to discover.
Yeah.
So one, depending on how I'm feeling that day and what I've uh what beverages I've had by that time of day, I like to kind of tease this out with the person to help them understand that it's really a bad or dumb question, even if I don't say it outright like that. So I might say something like, well, before I answer that, let me see if let me see where you're at on what you understand of what I believe. Are you implying that on my view, there's no connection or correlation between the mind and brain? Because
Mhm.
if the answer is yes, oh, well, then that's not my view. If the
Yeah.
answer is no, then what's the problem?
Yeah.
Right.
It's like
So,
straw
how
man.
is it? Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So how is it that if I get in a car wreck or have brain damage or Alzheimer's that deteriorates parts of my brain, it affects the functions of my mind, such as memory. And I'm like, well, that's no different than me grabbing the Wi-Fi router and tweaking a little bit, and it messes with the Wi-Fi, right? Or say I have an instrument. My go-to examples. I use a guitar. If I were to, let's say, play a song on the guitar, I don't know how to play guitar, but suppose I did and I was playing it, and then you came from behind and you started to detune and twist those knobs in the guitar as I'm playing it. Would that affect the pitch and sound of the music? Absolutely.
Mhm.
But does it follow from this that therefore I am a guitar, or that therefore the notes of the song are inside the guitar? And if I were to, you know, break it over my leg and then give it a good shake, the notes C and E flat and F sharp would fall out. Well, no, of course not. Who
Mhm.
who would think that the notes of a song are inside of the instrument any more than the thoughts of my mind are inside my brain? Now,
Mhm.
granted, there is a correlation between the a proper functioning guitar and being able to play the music in the right way. But just as if I were to pop a string, say I'd no longer be able to play certain notes of the song, well, the same way, if you deteriorate certain parts of my brain, I would no longer be able to have certain mental functions, such as a good working memory. But again, this doesn't prove they're the same thing. It doesn't prove that one is identical or reducible to the other. And the easy way to remember that is because cause or dependence relationships do not establish identity. Remember, earlier we talked about identity, meaning that two things are the same thing, literally identical, the same thing as. And in order for the physicalists to make their case, they have to establish identity. Not that there's merely a cause and effect relationship, not even that there's a dependency, but that they are identical. Because if anything, a cause and effect already implies two things at work or two things in play. There's a cause and the effect. Those are two different things. So for the physicalist to make its case, it has to show that therefore they're the same thing. But just because fire causes smoke, it doesn't mean smoke and fire are the same thing. It just means one's caused by the other. And just because messing with my brain affects my mind doesn't mean they're the same thing. Because again, establishing cause and effect or dependency relationship does not establish identity. And we can even tie this back into free will, because speaking of which, and it's also a two-way street. Messing with my brain can affect states of my mind, but interestingly, affecting states of my mind and choosing to simply think differently can affect states of my brain. So, one of the leading neuroscientists in the world on the issues of like OCD, depression, and anxiety is Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz, who is actually a Christian and a substance dualist. And what he's come to, in fact, so I just moved, like I mentioned, so I don't know where the book is at. It's in a box somewhere.
Yeah.
But he has some great books. One of them, I think, is "You Are Not Your Brain."
I think I've
And
heard
what
of
he's
that, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah, that name
and
sounded familiar when you said that, so I'm
yeah,
curious.
he's a renowned neuroscientist,
Mm.
and what he's basically shown is he in the beginning of the book he has a picture of a brain scan, and he shows the parts of the brain that light up with OCD. And then what he did was he put some of his patients on this experiment, if you will. And what he had them do was what he calls this 4-step process, where basically he had challenged them and encouraged them to, when they have OCD, to begin to think differently and challenge the thoughts of your brain. Because you see, while we do have free will, we still have certain things, sensations, desires, or even thoughts about ourselves or of ourselves, or thoughts that we just have, that are indeed causally determined by the chemistry and physics of our brain and body. So, for example, I don't choose to get hungry. I don't freely choose to get hungry. I just find myself, at a certain hour of the day with the sensation of hunger. It's nothing I will to have happen. It's
Mhm.
something that's causally determined on me. In the same way, people with OCD, anxiety, depression, these mental states, these sensations come upon them, and it's not something they will or desire to have. But that doesn't mean they're trapped in this.
Mhm.
So what he showed them to do was how to counteract and think, have thoughts against these mental sensations or beliefs that their body's inducing upon them based on their brain chemistry. And after a few months, he took another brain scan and he showed how it significantly reduced the OCD parts of their brain. In other words, I think it was gosh, what's his name? Thomas something, I forgot his name. Another neuroscience who said um, neurons that fire together wire together. And what we've discovered, and what Jeffrey Short has shown brilliantly, is that you can literally change the wiring of your brain, change your brain chemistry by simply thinking differently and
Mm.
thinking and challenging and going against the thoughts that your brain calls you, determines you to have. And so again, it's a two-way street where yes, affecting parts of my brain can affect parts of my mind or functions of my mind, but at the same time, engaging in certain functions of my mind can change the way my brain is wired. And note, to have this, you have to have what we would call libertarian free will. Um, Something that is going to transcend the physical and not be causally determined by the physical, but be able to transcend and act against the very physical determinations of your brain. So this would show also, I would say, that you're not identical or reducible to a mere brain and body. So, I mean, yeah, there's so much to dive and dig into, but just to recap, and I'll throw it back at you. Establishing cause and effect or dependence relationships do not establish identity, which is what the physicalist needs to show the mind and brain are the same thing. And it's a two-way street when it comes to affecting parts of my brain can affect parts of my mind, and at the same time, using my mind and thinking differently can affect parts of my brain.
Yeah, those are all, well, not all, but definitely some points in there that were very similar to what I've said before. Even if you use that car accident example, let's say somebody gets in a car accident and the car is, it's messed up. Maybe it's not totaled, but it doesn't function the way that it was supposed to function, or that the way that it did before. But you actually walk away unscratched. Well, now your ability to get around is going to be altered, but you yourself were not altered, because you are not your car. So, and kind of the instrument, thing. I kind of made a very similar point, is that you could have the world's best, whatever, guitar player, world's best saxophone player, whatever you want it to be. And let's say their instrument is damaged in transit somewhere. Well, now their ability to be the best musician in the world is going to be affected by their damaged instrument, if that's all they have to use. And
Right.
so, yeah, so they don't, yeah, right. It doesn't mean that one is the other thing. The saxophone player is not a saxophone, and a guitar player is not a guitar. So, I think those are really good points to make. And now I'm actually really interested to pick up that book you were just talking about. You said "You Are Not Your Brain." Is that what you think it's called?
Yeah, I believe so, by Jeffrey Schwartz. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look into that, because that sounds like it would be, um, up my alley in this discussion anyway. But yeah, you were going somewhere before all that, before I derailed us, and I'm not sure if you remember where it was, because maybe you have a better memory than I do, but it
I
seemed.
can assure you I don't. I just write stuff down.
Yeah, yeah,
That's because I know I don't have a good memory. I write stuff
yeah.
down.
I should probably
Um,
get in the habit of being better at that, but
eh, Well, I also take ADHD medication and it helps. So,
Oh, okay, there you go.
yeah, because hey, I'm not my brain, but I can act against the causal determinations of my brain.
Right.
So yeah, and I was talking about how some philosophers have sought to deny the consciousness because of
Oh, right,
what we
right.
discover the nature of consciousness is. But
Yeah.
even before going there, so when I often have these discussions with non-believers or physicalists, sometimes they'll jump in and say, well, "Okay, well, show me a mind without a brain," and this tickles me because again, it's so question begging. But here's my typical response: they'll say, "Show me a mind without a brain." And I say, well, before I do that, let me do you one better. Show me a mind. Just show me a mind first. Because how can I show you a mind without a brain if you can't first show me a mind? And what I'll sometimes do is I'll get a piece of paper, and on one side of the paper, I'll write the word brain. And on the other side of the paper, I'll write the word mind. And I'll say, show me a mind. And then they'll typically point to, oh, well, look, when you get hit over the head or you have, brain deterioration, you get Alzheimer's. And I say, time out. You're showing me brain. I'm
Mhm.
asking for mind.
Mhm.
Show me a mind. And everything they point to or talk about is always going to be something physical. And they'll say,
Mhm.
well, that's because the mind just is a brain. I'm like, well, now you're begging the question.
It's like
How can I show
hand
you?
me a law of logic out of the fridge, or hand me a transcendental, like something
Sure,
like
yeah.
that.
And so it's like they're begging the question by asking it. So I'm like, well, just show me a mind. Because how do you know anyone has a mind? How do you know there is a mind unless you're just going to beg the question and presuppose that that the mind just is a brain, and then you just get into circular reasoning. Because it's like, well, how do we know that the mind is the brain? Well, because when you think there's neurons firing, well, how do you know that's the same thing? Well, because we know that the mind and brain are the same thing.
Yeah, right.
So it just gets circular.
Mhm.
But now, given that what we talked about so far, that consciousness is not physical, how do we know? Because they don't share the same properties. Given Leibniz's law of identity, we know that if they were the same thing, they would share all the same properties. All we need is one example. We've already talked about like five or six, so they can't be the same thing. Now, because of this, because the implications are pretty huge for this. Because first of all, if there is a soul and mind that is immaterial, well, then that means that naturalism is false, and there is more to the more to the world than pure physics and chemistry. Now, I think it was I forget which atheist philosopher was like, if we go this route, then we're letting like an immaterial foot in the door. Um,
Oh,
and yet it
yeah, I know who you're talking about. I can't think of his name either, but I know the quote. I know the quote you're talking about. Yeah.
And so I think it was even Paul Churchland who said like we are creatures of pure matter, and there's no room for anything immaterial. And he even says something like we need to learn to live with that fact. We don't need there's no immaterial aspect to us, no souls, nothing like that. Well, because of this, because I would say it's so clear that the mind is immaterial and the brain is something physical. Well, then you have philosophers that have just begun to deny the existence or nature of consciousness altogether. The late Daniel Dennett was pretty popular for this, and this isn't just me saying this. John Sorrow, who's another atheist philosopher, actually critiques Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett's book is called Consciousness Explained, and John Sorrow, another atheist philosopher of mine, in kind of mocking it, says, "Well, you really should have called it Consciousness Explained Away," because what he basically does is Dennett says that consciousness is an illusion and is basically implying that well it doesn't exist. The irony here is that in order to have illusions you have to first be conscious. um, but let's run with this problem even further. um, so if I encounter someone, and I have a few times before, where they deny consciousness exists, I ask, well, do you believe that? Because remember, there are five states of consciousness, and one of those states is beliefs. And I
Mhm.
ask if you believe that, because if you believe that, you're essentially saying, I believe that beliefs do not exist.
Right.
Well, once you do that, now it's just self defeating, and then your
It's a
entire paradigm
suicide
collapses there. Yeah, and so Alex Rosenberg, same thing. He says we don't have beliefs, and again, you can't help but ask him, do you believe that? Because the moment you say yes, if you believe that we have no beliefs, then we have beliefs, and
Right. Yeah.
therefore consciousness exists.
Right. Yeah. That's yeah. It reminds me of like the Greg Kokel's tactics. The suicide tactic, just kind of pointing out self-defeating statements. There is no truth. Is that true? It just I think there's a lot of times that these things they sound complicated, but they're a lot easier than they sound. You know, when somebody says something like, you know, we don't have beliefs, you kind of get on the defense and you start thinking like, oh no, you know, where do I go with that? But I think if we can, you know, really grasp these ideas, they're pretty easy to tear down by just simply asking a question. You know, do you believe that? Like you just said, it's like, well, you pretty much just ruin their whole worldview in one question by asking that. So, um, no, that's all really good. There's so much information there. This is going to be one of those episodes that I'm going to go back to and like have to, you know, listen to multiple times and take notes because it is just very um, rich and very, you know, philosophically deep. And but I like those things because I like challenging myself and you know, thinking deeply, and I think that all plays into loving God with all of our minds, you know, and I think that that is something that we should be better at as a culture, you know, because right now we like to kind of rot away on TikTok and Instagram and just kind of veg out. But I think that we are called to so much more than that. And when God tells us to love him with all of our heart, soul, mind, all of our might, everything, that this is part of that, you know, kind of reading the things that are hard to read and really trying to understand hard concepts so that we can tear down strongholds and we can tear down kind of empty man-made philosophies and things like that. So I think this is all really good and really beneficial. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come on here and to discuss this. Like I said, I know you're crazy busy. You have, you know, you were telling me you had speaking engagements coming up and you're going to be traveling and you're a husband and a father. And, you know, you're probably doing all kinds of stuff. You have a book. So, you know, God knows what else is in store for you. But it really does mean a lot to me that you would take the time to come on the little guy's channel and you know, be a blessing. So thank you again for you know, being available.
No, thank you for having me on, and thank you for what you're doing. You know, we know a lot more people doing this.
Yeah.
And you know, just getting the content out there and showing the rational defense for the Christian worldview. But no, it's been a blessing. I'm happy to do it, and you know, we're as Scripture says, we're one body but many members, and we all
Mhm.
have our part and role to play.
Mhm.
And so I would just encourage you to keep going, keep it up, keep spreading the good news, and showing why Christianity is rationally and intellectually defensible.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. It's an endeavor, you know, and there's always more stuff to study and I'm always learning and I'm, you know, hopefully getting better at what I do. And it's because of people like you putting out content and books and cool things that I can read and study. And, you know, I started doing some seminary recently and that's going to help with the
Very
kind of
nice.
formal aspect of it and being able to understand theology at a deeper level. And so, yeah, it all plays a part. And so, yeah, thanks again. And where can people find you? Do you have your own YouTube channel? I know we mentioned your ministry name, and you know there's the website for that, which is just ehmapologetics.org. So
Yep.
um,
Yeah.
we can
So
find you
EHM
there. But
Apologetics.
where else?
Yeah, sorry, ehmapologetics.org, and then you can even look at the events and see where I'm speaking at next. And I'm still having to update that when I get time. Like I mentioned earlier, we just moved, and then unloading and packing, settling and all that stuff. And then yeah, my YouTube channel, you can just type in youtube.com/Eric Hernandez or type my name in, Eric Hernandez.
Mhm.
One of the few Hispanic apologists on YouTube. And
You and Eli
then
Ayala.
yeah, yeah, he's a good friend of mine,
Yeah, yeah,
he's an awesome guy. We've known each other for years, and you
yeah.
were even talking about Kokel earlier. So Greg Kokel actually helped me come up with the title of my book.
Oh, nice.
Um, so when I was explaining to him, because he's very good with titles, he's very creative, and I said, well, I call this, you know, the approach I take, I call it the lazy approach, and I'm trying to explain to him apologetics and evangelism, and he came up with that title. So I'm very appreciative for him.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Um, But yeah, my website, ehmapologetics.org, YouTube channel, and then you can find me on other socials. Just type my name in. We are a donor supported, donor funded ministry.
Mm.
So again, our kind of goal is plant seeds, pull weeds. We want to equip believers and reach skeptics. And so this weekend I'll be going to Utah, and I'll be doing some doing a youth conference out there for a church out there called Bridgeway. Awesome group. I work with the ministry called Maven, and I do these apologetic mission trips. And sometimes when we go to Utah, we stay there at that church because we take high school students, sometimes college students. And then speaking of apologetic mission trips, I'm going there for the weekend and then flying from Utah to Arizona and then leading a week long apologetic mission trip in Arizona where we're going to be talking to non-believers, some new age, some skeptics, things of that nature, with about 30 high school students. So we send them training and then we meet them somewhere in a different state where I'm not from, where they're not from, and then we go witness and evangelize. And in fact, that week we're actually bringing, at least on 2 occasions, we're bringing in atheists to come talk to the students. So
Mhm.
we not just go talk to quote unquote strangers, but this week we'll bring in one atheist who's actually a good friend of mine, Richard Suttles. He goes by he used to go by the Faith Atheist. Now it's like I forget. He changes the name so many times because people keep trying to get his pages shut down.
Oh, man.
Um, the Fallen Atheist is what he calls himself now. But anyways, he's a good friend of mine. He'll be giving like a 30, 45-minute presentation to the students. And then the students are allowed for about 30, 45 minutes to ask questions. And I stay out of it as much as possible. And
Yeah.
then the next time that same week, the next time we're bringing in an atheist that week, we're actually bringing in an agnostic philosophy professor who actually went to Biola, and I even think took some classes from Craig, and he's going to give a presentation on why he's an atheist. Again, gives this presentation, students ask questions, I stay out of it. So yeah, it's that's part of the many things that we do here, but really appreciate your prayers,
Mm.
in support that whether it be again prayerfully, financially, or just any kind of encouragement. um Already mentioned the book Laser Approach to Evangelism. You can get that on Amazon. And you can also, if you have read it, would appreciate writing a review. There's one review that's like a 1 star, and the guy literally starts out by saying, "I'll admit I haven't read it, but."
Why even
Yeah,
bother leaving a review at that point? I mean,
yeah, but yeah,
that's awesome, man. I love those types of exercises because I think there are so many kids that are never exposed to atheism, or they're just never exposed to anything other than what they grow up knowing. If you grow up in a Christian household, you're just kind of taught that that's true, and you assume that that's true, and you never hear the arguments against it. And so I think it's awesome to expose them to that so that they're not in like some form of shell shock or something when they leave the home or go to college or enter into the workforce. And I've been doing some similar stuff at my kids' school, helping the Bible teacher there. I'll come in every so often and I'll play the part of an atheist or like a Muslim or a agnostic or something like that, and I'll debate them,
very nice.
and see where their mind is, how they process these things and where they go to defend these things, and they're getting better, so it's cool.
Good.
It's cool to see the wheels turning there, and kind of making more, like this one girl, she started making more kind of like worldview foundational arguments, more kind of like philosophical arguments, and pointing out just discrepancies in the worldview, showing how it kind of falls apart and doesn't work, and so it's cool to see. It's cool to see that they're learning that stuff, and hopefully it kind of fosters a deeper understanding of those things, and they're able to bring that
Amen.
into the world when they enter into the quote unquote real world. But yeah, that's awesome, man. You're doing some really cool stuff, and appreciate the work you're doing in the kingdom there, and definitely
Thank you.
be in prayers there. And anybody watching this or listening to this, if you feel led to support his ministry monetarily or prayerfully or however it is that you want to support, then by all means do that. He's doing awesome stuff. Buy his book, learn the material. study the brain and the mind, and really confuse people when you go out there. So
Yeah.
it's because it gets into the weeds, but it's a fun topic. So again, thanks, Eric, so much again for being on here. And
Thank you.
of course, anybody again watching, listening, brothers and sisters, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you. Do that with love and respect and gentleness. And thank you for supporting what I do, supporting this ministry. And I'll see you next time. Appreciate you.